an addiction specialist. I'm Bob Weathers and happy to have you with us. With me today is
Odie Martinez.
Good. Thanks for joining me, Odie. And in the studio we have Austin Armstrong, who's manning all the technical aspects. So appreciate you all joining the three of us today here in the studio. Our topic today is restoring hope in recovery, and I'll be moving into that in just a moment. But I wanted to share a couple of events of the last 24 hours or so that feel significant to me to kind of lend depth, I think, to the conversation. As fate would have it, I typically each week introduce myself as being a professor of clinical psychology and have been so for 33 years. I was realizing in the last 33 years, there's only been 1 year that I haven't been working in a university setting as a professor and administrator, and just this week finally resigned the last academic position, and it's very significant to me because I've done it for so long. Hello, Danielle. Thanks for joining us. I think so it's a good move for me because the work that I'm doing right now, which is what I really want to be doing, is recovery coaching. I'm really happy to be doing that, but it's letting go of something that's been so familiar. And I actually I reviewed it this morning. 33 years is a long time to have done something. I've worked primarily for 2 different universities, but actually over the course of that time, probably taught at half a dozen or more in our universities. I actually listed the universities, the years that I worked there. And for now, for the foreseeable future, I see myself continuing to do what I've been doing increasingly, which is working exclusively in recovery coaching, which includes a number of things for me that relate to teaching. It is not like I won't be teaching, but I won't be teaching in a university setting. And I think it was particularly highlighted for me just in the last hour. When I came in today, I told Austin and Odie that I was a little bit more somber or serious today, and I'll tell you what it was. I saw a woman who reminded me very much of my dear friend Faith. I met Faith 42 years ago when I first started studying psychology. It was 42 years ago, the fall of 1977. We were best friends for all of those years. She passed away this past summer. And so I have this link to faith and psychology, and also she spent her whole career as a professor at one single university. She worked at one single university. I taught at this university for a couple of years myself, California State University at San Bernardino. And so today's presentation is in honor of faith and in honor of change, and I think to own up to kind of the 3-dimensionality. You know, Odie and I come each week and we present, but we're presenting stories from our lives, and our lives for all of us have multiple dimensions, and this is part of the backdrop of my being with you today. I'll be less likely to jump up and click my heels today than I typically might, and on another day it might be Odie. It's just our lives as they are. And I wanted to share that with you. The term that psychology uses for this, and it's actually a word that I used with Austin, I said I'd like to be congruent. Psychology suggests that, for example, a therapist needs to be congruent and actually model for his or her clients their own being congruent, and that is to connect up how you're presenting to the world with how you're feeling inside. To which Austin said, "Would you like a cup of coffee, Bob?" Which I think is a great solution. And today I did not have a cup of coffee. I will pass on that, Austin, but I'll take you up on that next week. Okay, at any rate. I think there's a place for coffee, and I think there's also a place for congruence, and so my wish is to be congruent today with you. So the slides that I created for this week include my being a professor of clinical psychology, ... And as far as I know, for the foreseeable future, I'm retiring from that profession. And I've been working on this transition for the last several years, but am now fully engaged as of this week in recovery coaching and all that entails. And so welcome to Ask an Addiction Specialist, and here we go. I want to review real quickly what we covered last week and then transition into today's topic. Last week we had a guest, really appreciate his presence. Dr. Tommaso Redi from Switzerland came and joined us. And for those of you that were here, it was a real treat. And if you weren't here, I want to recommend that you access in our archives, either through Ask an Addiction Specialist on Facebook or through YouTube, same title, or at the website of Beginnings Treatment Centers under their podcast archive. Beginnings is our sponsor along with Therapy Cable each week for this podcast, and we have all of our podcasts over the last year. This is number 55. That's amazing. So there's 55 podcasts that you can check out, and I want you to check them all out and like them all, right, Austin? Last week was a real treat. It was Dr. Rudy Tomas, as I call him, and Tomas brought in a holistic or integrative perspective to looking at life, really. His background is as a holistic dentist. He's one of the thought leaders in Europe in this whole area, and he brings a certain, there's a depth and a breadth both to his approach to medicine and dentistry that's an inspiration to all of us who work in the field of addiction and recovery. And I think the thing that stuck with me the most is our talking into the spirituality that's underneath our physical diseases, even dental diseases, and certainly right in the heart of addiction. And I really appreciate our talking at length into the topic of wisdom. It's an unusual experience to be able to share with somebody with such depth himself, such obvious depth. And I think you'd really find great benefit if you weren't here to check out that video from last week. We want to transition then to today's topic. As I said earlier, it's restoring hope in recovery. In fact, I thought of it today when I saw the woman that reminded me of Faith, my recently deceased and longtime friend. Today is faith and hope in recovery, and we'll be talking about both, really. Let me mention this while I'm thinking of it, is that Austin is really good about relaying your questions and comments to Odie and me. So feel free to submit your questions through Facebook. Looks like somebody already has, and he'll relay those to me. So he'll sort of moderate today. So, oh, thank you. This is from Angela. It's great to see you with us, Angela. I see you out there, and I appreciate what she says. She says, "Thanks for sharing hope and inspiration and recovery." And I love the butterfly image too, Angela. Thank you. Yeah, we'll be talking about butterflies actually later today. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Your presence has been such a joy and such a boon to every weekly presentation. So Odie and I talk about this. You're the third participant in our presentation each week. And then add Austin to it. That makes us 4 pretty regular presenters here. So thanks for joining us, Angela. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. As Angela has, then I want to recommend that any of you that feel so inclined to submit questions as we go along, and we do the best we can to weave those in as we talk. Mm-hmm. So much of the work that I do in recovery coaching, and many of the threads throughout a year's worth of podcasts have dealt with a few topics that are interwoven. One is addiction, and we look at addiction in its etymological sense as being related to the Latin root word of enslavement, to be a slave. And so we're looking at anything that enslaves us, that we cannot stop, and that's harming us, harming our relationships, harming our vocation in the world. So we weave together addiction with recovery. We talk about recovery in different ways, but one of the metaphors that we've used is to recover your original destiny. In the East, they call it your original face before you were born. In the Judeo-Christian heritage, we talk about the image of God within, but it's recovering who you really are. And so addiction, recovery, we talk about the relationship of stress to addiction, and particularly stress in relationship to relapse. It's the number one trigger for relapse, and stress manifests in many forms, from financial stress and relational stress to boredom. And one of the topics that we've addressed a lot over the course of the last year is that emotions can be stressful, and it turns out that the most stressful human emotion, more stressful than anger, more stressful than sadness, more stressful than fear, is the human emotion of shame. So we've talked about shame in various ways, but it's basically the feeling inside that there's something defective, wrong, broken inside of me, and that you are likely to reject me because of that. And then we fall into a sinkhole, and that sinkhole emotionally is extremely painful. And for many individuals, if this doesn't trigger their moving into addiction, it may trigger their relapse to addiction if they're once out of it. So we talk about shame as a very significant, from a psychological perspective, it may be the most significant topic that we could introduce in any discussion about recovery. So what I want to start with today, in light of that background or that context, is to suggest that shame can be healed. And that's no slight thing, because because first of all, shame is fairly secretive. I don't share my shame with you. You don't share yours with me typically. I remember there was one study that looked at what are the main secrets that people in America have, and there were three. There were secrets about, I don't want you to know how incompetent I feel, which would be related to shame. I don't want you to know how alone I feel, which would be related to shame. And the third one has to do with sexual secrets of all kinds. And those also are attached to shame. So all three of the secrets that are most common, this is a massive study in the U.S., the most common secrets that we keep are attached to shame. And so I keep my shame, I'm actually ashamed of my shame, if that makes sense. And so it stays in hiding and doesn't get addressed. And so one of the things we've talked about here is in order to address shame, it requires me being vulnerable with you, being vulnerable with others, being vulnerable with myself, open to my shame. In fact, we've talked about vulnerability. The etymology or the root of the word vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnus, and vulnus in Latin simply means wound. It means for me to be willing to honestly bring my wound to you and you to me so that we can heal it. And so that's a start towards the healing of shame. So first of all, we're saying that shame can be healed. But in order to really give any kind of heft to that kind of claim, we've got to first understand that there's a very close connection between shame and hope. I just had a group that met earlier today. I just got here from another group, and I came in today and I asked the group, I said, what gives you guys hope in recovery? And there was one man in the group that had been through the treatment a year or two ago. I knew him from before. He was actually in for round two of his treatment. And so I put the question to him and to the entire group. And we had a whole hour's conversation about various foundations for hope for those in that room, all of whom are recovering from severe addiction. But let's talk about the relationship then of shame to hope, because there's a very strong relationship, and it's a very sad, it's a very tragic relationship. Shame basically will squash or banish hope. How that goes is if I am broken, then this is the damaging nature of shame within myself, is if I feel like that I'm broken, there's nothing you can do to help me, because basically the mechanism that you're offering advice to is broken. And then if you look at the interpersonal the aspect of shame, which is that other people look at me and judge me, then not only do I feel broken inside, but people treat me as broken. And so what hope is there for me? I want to start with an exercise then, if I can, and ask you to reflect for just a moment on this. And then Odie, you and I will share about this. First of all, can you think of how it is that shame within in yourself, just towards yourself, how it can demoralize or suck away hope? Can you think about that for just a second? How does shame within undermine your sense of hope for healing, for change, for a positive future? Think about that for just a moment. There'll be a second question. Okay, that's the first question. The second question is, can you think about how it is that you have felt shame in the presence of others, typically people that matter most to us? It's the people that we care the most about, that affect us the most around shame. Can you think about how you have felt ashamed, let's say with a family member or another loved one, and again felt just absolutely demoralized, just sapped of any hope for that ever changing, that they would ever see you differently, that they would ever respond to you differently? Odie and I have the fortunate task to be able to talk about this in front of everybody. Okay. And Odie has the even worse task because I always ask him, do you want to share first? That seems very unfair. I want to invite you if you'd like to, Odie, and I promise
absolutely.
I'll share. Yeah.
Well, the task isn't as difficult, luckily, but say the way that shame it zaps the hope, as you mentioned it. I've had troubles in the past of not feeling good enough.
Yes.
So just that shame of thinking that I'm not good enough. Yeah. Well, for example, okay, maybe I'm not good enough to get this project finished, so it saps away that hope of ever getting the project finished. Yeah. And then as for, what was the second question?
About others attitudes to you or others' behavior to you. In other words, when others shame you,
right? How
that can also do the same thing you just described.
Right.
What goes on within can also come between us.
So that say in the past as well, when I was going through my struggles with pornography, it's when somebody that you love hears it for the first time, they're not gonna reciprocate or answer to it positively. At least you don't expect them to, right?
No.
And so just having that, admitting that, and then having somebody that you love say something back, and not in an accepting manner, so to speak. Saying like, well, I thought you said that you were done with that, sort of deal. Just kind of
which
adds to the shame.
Exactly.
Adds to the shame of like, well, I'm already admitting it, so now just hearing that makes me feel like maybe one, I shouldn't have shared, and two, am I ever going to change this behavior?
Those are perfect examples. I really appreciate you sharing, Odie, every week. I really do. I had a thought about what I was going to share, and then as I listened to you, it moved in a slightly different direction, and I'm impacted by what you shared. Because of the work that I do recovery coaching, and it's a combination of running groups here locally, as well as meeting clients, some locally. I've got a client here locally in my office right after our podcast today. Led a group right before to here. It's just, that's kind of my schedule. I also see clients online. I see clients through Skype and so on. And I had a client this morning on Skype from another country. And because of the nature of what I'm doing, I'm more self-disclosing as a recovery coach, because the nature of the work is to share our addictions and try to heal them. And so I will end up sharing when appropriate more of my story. I did this morning with this particular client, and I think that he found it very useful. But as I was sharing with him my story, it really brought up for me this topic of today's podcast, which was recognizing that earliest when I first came to grips or face to face with my addiction, the horrible shame of that. But I think what I want to do, rather than go into that, and it came from me listening to you, is I want to roll back actually before that. So and I could follow that, and that would be true. That's what I had intended to talk about. But in the years leading up to my coming face to face with my addiction, so I was increasingly subject to addiction. My addiction was alcohol and other drugs. Is that during those years leading up to my finally kind of coming face to face with myself, is that I did a lot of things that were really awful. And I didn't connect them to addiction because I couldn't face my addiction. So it was almost like indirectly the behaviors that I was engaging in that hurt other people and hurt myself for sure. There was a sense of I think the inside commentary, if there was a voice, it'd be something like, what kind of person does such stupid stuff, Bob? I was talking to myself. And I actually, since we're going to talk about the interpersonal, I actually had colleagues and friends. I hate to even call them friends because there were some people that said some things that, aren't what friends say to other friends. So I'll call them professional colleagues or acquaintances.
Right.
And I can think of a couple right now that said the same thing, but they said it from the outside, basically with hands on hips, with scorn in voice. What kind of person does that kind of lame stuff, Bob? And I didn't have an answer for them, but I felt really faulty, like I couldn't make sense of it, and I wasn't stopping some of the bad choices. I made some catastrophically bad choices along the way. And it wasn't until I came face to face with my addiction and that I was out of control.
Right. Yeah.
And that I had to address the addiction. Could I begin to develop a different standpoint than there was something broken inside of me? You could say there's something broken around the addiction, and I wouldn't disagree. I think of addiction, certainly among other perspectives, I think of addiction as a disease. It's a disease of the brain. It's a disease of the mind. It's a disease of the soul. We got lots of ways we can talk about it. But until I faced that, I kept repeating behaviors that were really not true to me, but I was doing them. And so that's what came up as listening to you. And then certainly then when coming out with the addiction, like for you, so for me, coming out with the addiction and then facing the judgment from outside for that. It was it's like the reward for finally coming out honestly is more shame. I was like, oh, now we're really going to shame you. And it's understandable because you and I have violated ourselves in terms of our own values, let's say. And other people have been hurt. There are other people who have been hurt by that. Other people have been violated as well. They have a right to be offended and so on. But it's really, really hard, at least especially for me, especially early in recovery. And almost by definition, 90% of the people I work with as a recovery coach are early in recovery, and they're dealing with incredible repercussions from the people that they care about most. It's like you said, you think, it was implied in what you said. It's oh, thank you so much for sharing with me, Odie. Yeah. That's not the response. And it's understandable that's not the response. But it's really hard for somebody who has not dealt with addiction and recovery to understand how difficult that is. And in fact, there's one gentleman to my right today in the group that said, Dr. Bob, when people talk to me that way, do you know what I do? And I looked at him and I nodded. And I said, yes, I do know what they do. And he said, I relapse. I use. Yeah. He resorts to the addictive behavior because that's what he does to reduce stress. And that's the loop that we can get caught in. Yeah. There's a comment or two up on the screen. Let's take a pause here and look at this. Let me just glance down real quick. Okay. It looks like there's 3 different comments there, and they may be all related. Let me just read the first comment. Absolutely think that if those who haven't been through it or had a loved one go through it, that they'll look at my recovering addiction as being a junkie. Because some say once a junkie, always a junkie. You know, this reminds me, I'm just re-listening yesterday to material from one of my favorite resources in the whole area of addiction recovery. And many of you will be familiar with it. It's Dr. Kevin McCauley out of Utah. He has 2 DVDs that are really, they're just top recommendations I make to anybody that's dealing with any form of addiction, whether it's substance or behavioral addiction. The first DVD, and many of you, like I said, will be familiar with it. The first DVD is called Pleasure Unwoven, and it looks at what happens in the brain around any addiction, and it's a really helpful way to manage shame. I think, is to understand this is what my addictive behavior has done. I need to change my life, but until I change my life, this addiction will have this impact on my behavior in terms of what it does to my brain. His second DVD is what I was listening to yesterday. I was actually listening to it as I was working out, and it's called Memo to Self. And he was discussing in this DVD, this point that this individual made, is that he was a physician who lost his license, Dr. Bacali, owing to prescription medication addiction. He lost his license, actually went to prison for this. And when he got out, this is interesting, kind of in the spirit of what we're doing. When he got out, when he served his time, then the state board, so he was in the military, and so he went to a military prison. He got out of that, and then the state board of medicine came after him, and they wanted to throw him in jail too for what he'd done. And they and so there was further punishment. And he describes in this DVD, Memo to Self, if you have an interest, I really recommend you seeing this. It's a really very powerful resource for engaging in strong early recovery. He talks about what it was like to sit with a judge. Ironically, it was in our county. It was in Orange County. It was a judge in Orange County who basically looked at him and said, I need to send you to jail, in essence, because you're never going to get better. And kind of them as fighting words.
Yeah.
Dr. McCauley got better, and he's made his career in recovery at this point. But that judgment can come from outside. And for any of us that have dealt with addiction of whatever kind, we know what it's like inside. It's nip and tuck. It's really challenging to address an addiction, to begin to transform one's life. But the common attitude is once a junkie, always a junkie. Once an addict, always an addict. And Dr. McCauley talked into that in a very painful way yesterday. It really hit home for me.
Yeah.
There was... let's see. Okay, then the next comment was, see the person first, not the disease. Would that were the case. I really agree.
Yeah.
I really agree. In fact, as we talk in a few minutes about butterflies, I want to come back to that statement, is for us to be able to start with ourselves, to remember Odie, to remember Bob, that I am, I was standing up today in the group. I don't think I'll stand up because I'll be out of the camera, but I was standing up, I think when those lights just went off.
Yeah.
I was standing up next to a client right next to me, and I said, if I carve, I'm going to use you for Odie.
You're fine.
If I carve out the front half of your brain, the forebrain, I said, what's left? Will that still be Odie? And the group said, no, that won't be Odie, because we've talked enough about this. What's left is the midbrain, which is the emotional center of the brain, and the hindbrain, which controls our respiration and heartbeat and so on. But the parts that make you and I who we are, in terms of compassion and caring, being able to communicate, being able to know the difference between right and wrong, long-term planning, all of those things are a function of the forebrain.
Right.
If you take that away, what's left is a very impulsive person that's very limited. In fact, what I said, what's left is a lizard. It's only being slightly facetious with that, is that if you take out that part of our brain in which our identity, our self, I'd even say our spirituality is located, you're left with less than Odie. You're left with less than Bob. And so that for somebody to see Odie as a disease, or Bob as a disease, is to miss that Bob and Odie are people, that we're persons. And it's really crucial that we see ourselves that way. And I'm going to talk about this later today. It's really critical that we have people that mirror that, people that see you three-dimensionally.
Right.
I started today by sharing a little bit of what's going on for me today. I want to be here three-dimensionally. I'm not just a cardboard figure any more than you are. And when we're caught in a disease of addiction, that's part of what we're struggling with, but you're not a disease. It reminds me many, many years ago. I've forgotten about this. That makes it sound like it was hundreds of years ago. It was actually decades ago. It was actually over 40 years ago. About 45 years ago, in my first marriage, my wife worked for a doctor who happened to be the doctor I grew up with. She was his office manager, and I loved this doctor all the way through. I'm not going to name him because of what I'm going to say right now, but I love this doctor. But she worked with him, and she came home one day and she said that when he's dealing with somebody with cancer or some other disease, he'll say, "That's my cancer," or "That's my diabetes." He'd refer to the patient by their disease. Now it's shorthand.
Yeah.
It's shorthand to say, that's so-and-so, that's this addiction, that's its addiction.
Right.
But I have to tell you, even as a young man, I was barely 21, I remember that not sitting well with me. It's like, oh, now I'm a hernia? Or a ingrown toenail, or whatever like that. And I get the shorthand, but it's really, really dicey. You got to be really careful. And then about 20 years later, I was supervising someone. I also won't name this person because I loved him dearly too. He came in one time and sat with me, and he said, "I want to talk about my borderline," referring to one of his clients who apparently merited the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And because I had already had this preparation about 10 or 20 years before with the cancer business, I went, whoa, it's really not okay with me, and I don't think it's okay with your client. even that we would talk about your client as being your borderline.
Right.
To be really careful, because as soon as we do that, we lose the person, mistake them for the disease. And I don't think he meant ill either. I think it was just shorthand, but I had a real problem with that shorthand. Because I think it's one very short step from talking about you or I as having an addiction to now we're an addict, or like this person said, we're a junkie, and we all know that once a junkie, always a junkie, once an addict, always an addict. I think that's really problematic.
And I feel that you would probably treat them differently.
I think so too. I think if you were looking at me and you were going, that Bob is a cancer, or that Bob is but that I'm your borderline. I think if you were looking at me, I've got to believe that I would feel that in the interactions. It's like, I think he thinks I'm borderline. Oh, I got to tell you a story. Okay. Years ago, I had a client come in and he says, I want to know what your diagnosis of me is. I remember this as well. It clears a bell. This is 25 years ago. And I said, well, I'm not sitting and thinking of you diagnostically. And I thought we were good. The next week he came and said, no, I really want to know what your diagnosis was. And in fact, he told me what it was. He says, in fact, I think I know what my diagnosis is. And he said, it's narcissistic personality disorder. No, it wasn't. It wasn't narcissistic. I stand corrected. It was paranoid personality disorder. And I looked at him and I said, okay. He says, do you see me that way? And I said, no, I don't see you in those categories. I don't. I had worked with him for some months, and that really wasn't how I thought about him. That's not how I think about clients anyway. So I thought we were good with that. The next week he came in and he said, he went up to my bookshelf and he pulled the diagnostic manual off the bookshelf, the DSM. He says, we're going to look this up. I thought, oh, great, here we go. And so we opened it up. We found paranoid personality disorder. And he said, would you please read it? So I read, they have about 6 or 8 criteria that if you match those, then you merit the diagnosis of paranoid personality disorder. And so I read through those and I said, what do you think? He says, I think that's what I am. And I looked at him and I didn't use these words, but I'll use them here. I said, well, how's that working for you? It's just like, what the heck good does that do to anyway? And part of the issue, and it would, there might be a circumstance where that would make sense to have a client understand.
It's like not self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, right? There was something about it, at least with him, I want to say this, that our naming him, I was very concerned. Let me skip to the story where I was going with this. And this is the butterfly story, because this will make sense. And I'll get to the other questions in just a minute, but we have to follow this up for a second. I shared this sometime in the last year. Austin, you'll remember this. When I was 8 years old, I was in 3rd grade, and I was given a science project. And we lived out in the country in Central California. The science project was whatever we wanted to do. Well, I decided what I wanted to do was make a butterfly collection.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so we went to the local craft store, Wayne's Craft Market, I think is what it's called. Got a little net and all the other accoutrements, and I set about catching butterflies, moths. Actually caught a dragonfly, believe it or not, I caught them all. Now the story gets sadder in a hurry. My dad, who was a doctor, had chloroform, and so what we'd do is we'd catch these things, and then we would, as I recall, put it in a chloroform. I think it was in a cotton ball. It's been too many years, just a few years ago. And we would basically kill the butterflies. It was a gentle death, but they died. Okay. And then after that, I had to stick pins through them and pin them. I had like this right here. This is, what I have here is, it's a black table. It was a black velvet case about half this size. And I had butterflies pinned and moths and the dragonfly over here. And my dad, who was the doctor, knew Latin, so we actually wrote the Latin terms for a monarch butterfly, a dragon-tailed butterfly, and the dragonfly. And so we had all this, and I remember sitting in my room with my butterfly collection and bursting into tears. It was like, I love butterflies, which was the idea of a 3rd grader. Wouldn't that be cool to have a butterfly collection? But what I didn't connect was that to do that, you have to kill them. Yeah. And then what I had is I had all these butterflies with pins sticking through their bodies. They weren't butterflies anymore. They weren't alive anymore. And I remember being really not happy about what I had done. I took it to school because it was done with such loving care or whatever. I won 1st place in the science fair with my butterfly connection, which actually made it worse. It was like, it was bad enough, and now people were saying, That's such a great butterfly connection, little Bobby. It was so depressing to me what I had done.
Yeah.
That image has stayed with me my whole life, and it's tied into what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So when my client comes in and says, I want you to look up in that manual what my diagnosis is, I can't help but feel, at least some part of me, that we're going to stick a pin right through him and put a Latin label underneath his name,
Right, yeah.
and then we'll lose who he is. I still remember his first name. I won't say it right now. I remember his whole name. It's been 25 years. I would rather remember him as the one that I remember, not as a Latin name with a pin through him.
Right. Yeah.
And so it goes, especially in addiction. It's so easy for us to get labeled and diagnosed because we've hurt people. And it's actually kind of okay to stick a pin through Odie and through Bob and put them on a mat and give them a label. And it's harder than heck to stay out of that sinkhole that we're talking about with that kind of labeling going around.
Absolutely. I agree. 100%.
There were a couple of other comments about, boy, that story.
Yeah.
Bobby and the butterflies.
Sounds like a novel.
Some of our learning experiences, right? This person says, do you think we have to be abstinent from addictions first before we can heal our shame base? What a great question. What a great question. Do you think we have to be abstinent from addictions first before we can heal our shame base? My sense of it is that it's synergistic. And it's a great question, is that I think it's both and that is to say that one of the ways I can heal my shame base is to work on my addiction, and working on my addiction helps heal my shame base, and I can't even separate them out, because for so many people, one of the we already talked about this as well, the primary trigger for the initial addiction was trying to fill that hole inside that didn't feel okay. And so you can actually stop my addictive behaviors and I'll be left with that hole inside. And so you want to address that hole inside. And I think this is implied in the question. One of the problems with my addictive behaviors is that, especially when it comes to addictive behaviors with substance, is that it limits my capacity for self-reflection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we go back to the image I had earlier, if we scoop out half of your brain and half of my brain, who's left to reflect on shame? It's the brain is very compromised in active addiction.
You know, I pictured this, and I think you'll appreciate it. So, you know, the people that, I don't know what they're called, but they lay bricks, and then they put like a slab of...
Are those bricklayers?
I guess, I don't know. Bricklayers.
Wait, there's a Latin term for that. I'll find it and I will pin it. Okay, we'll call them bricklayers. I think it's bricklayers.
So, you know, in order to keep building on top of your recovery, you know, you have to put a slab of the concrete before you keep putting the bricks, you know. Because if you just put brick on brick, it's not going to stick. You know, tumble over.
I love the image. I'm so thick-headed, and I have a trauma around bricklaying, which I'll save for another podcast. I won't go into that right now. Can you help me make the connection? I'm sorry, because I realize I'm a little bit thick, because I know you've got a pointer. There's bricks, and then there's the concrete or whatever the mortar is, right?
Right, yeah.
And so what is the mortar in this metaphor?
So, as they mentioned, you know, do you need to be abstinent of your addiction? In order to...
I think I got it.
The shame base thing, and then you mentioned the hole that's that's missing to fill it. Right. So in order to continue to build your recovery, you know, and you said it's synergistic with both. You got it both ends. So
I like that. I like that. And it doesn't matter how you enter it. It doesn't matter which the brick is and which the mortar is. Is that I think it requires grace from somewhere for us to even enter into recovery. So can somebody see me without judging me? I feel like it's imperative for me as a recovery coach in the work I do to see my clients without judgment. And I oftentimes will ask, I said, do you experience judgment from me? And these are clients that would tell you if they did.
Right,
There's
yeah.
no holds barred. It's just really important for me to keep. Carl Jung, who was so influential in the early days of AA in terms of correspondence and so on, talked about his image was of a surgeon has to have clean hands. I feel like it's really imperative on me if I'm working with anybody towards healing that I have clean hands, and that is to say that there be no shame
Right.
that I'm bringing to the equation.
Right.
Okay, and so to the extent I can administer grace or compassion, that's a brick. And then that person is going to take that brick and begin to put in some of the mortar, which would be working on their addiction or their recovery,
Right. Yeah.
so that they can actually begin to absorb even another brick. And so on it goes, something like that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like that. Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And then Austin, I believe, found.
Okay, here we go. Bricklaying in Latin. My dad would appreciate this. My father, who's passed away somewhere, he's getting a big laugh out of this. Fictellus nimini imposiorus. That's great, Austin. Oh man, we're on a roll today. Yeah. So my guess is that this is to stretch a metaphor. Since we're talking about Latin, all roads lead to Rome. And what I mean by that is back to the bricks again. All roads lead to Rome is that addressing the shame leads to recovery. Addressing the recovery leads to the healing of shame. And I see them as continuous. It's almost impossible to separate those out.
Absolutely.
Okay, there's another question here. And I see a photo. Oh, thank you so much. From Angela. This is a picture of a living butterfly on a fingertip. That's what little Bobby wanted to do, and I just didn't get the concept until it was too late. Thank you, Angela. That's right. I wish you all could see this. It's a great image. It's a great image of a butterfly landing on a fingertip. That was my relationship to butterflies as a boy, not pinned to a black velvet mat with Latin names underneath of it. There's a question here, another question. What do you think would be helpful for a person with an addiction to hear, to encourage but not enable them? That's a fabulous question, and it's actually sent to me, but I'm going to I've shared that with Odie. Odie, do you mind commenting? I'd like to talk with you about that. The question is, what would be helpful for a person with an addiction to hear? You and I both know addiction from the inside.
Right.
What was helpful to us, and what was encouraging to us without being enabling of the addiction? I think it's a great question. Thank you.
I think what helped me out a lot was that when I had a conversation about what I was struggling with, that I was able to be vulnerable about the situation, and having to see the other person receptive to it, but also I guess knowing me well enough to catch on to the bull, and just calling me out on it.
Yes.
But in a loving manner, not
Yeah.
just like, no, you're wrong,
Yeah.
you're lying, blah, blah, blah. Instead of saying, okay, well, I understand, I understand what you're saying, but have you ever thought of it in this light or in this fashion? You know? I think just being careful, but at the same time being as honest as you can about the situation.
There's an image that comes to my mind as I'm listening to you, and it's not a tradition with which I have a lot of familiarity, but it's out of Japan. It's the tradition of the samurai warrior. Some of you will have read about samurai warriors and seen movies and so on. I've seen a few movies. But my understanding, and this is more mythological maybe than literal, is that in the samurai tradition, you're trained as a warrior to, for example, utilize a sword with incredible precision. I had a friend who had done a fair bit of studying of samurai warcraft, and said that they actually got so good, I think, that they operated through the Middle Ages right up until the last century. They were so good with swords that they could actually strike an opponent and kill that opponent, running them through with a sword without hitting bone.
Whoa.
The idea is that they'd go through the cartilage. And I don't mean to gross everybody out.
No.
But it's just an idea of that kind of focus and concentration is like scary. But there's another image that's even deeper than that, because to do that you have to be very centered. But they have this ethic at the heart of the samurai, and it makes me think of what would be helpful in terms of response, is that when they utilized the sword, because they were very skilled at it, when they utilized the sword, they were required to do it with no anger. And so you couldn't strike somebody out of violence. It was meant to protect, for example, the village or the emperor, that kind of thing. And so the ethic was so strong that if they got angry and used a sword in anger, they were required to commit suicide. They were required to kill themselves because they had violated the samurai code. That was the image that came in as I was listening to you. And I realize it's an ideal image, but the image that if I'm in addiction and you're my brother, that you would confront me, and that you would confront me as hard as necessary, but that you would not do that to violate me. In fact, you would not do that out of anger. Right. You would do that just out of kind of clarity. You wouldn't hit any bone like that. And I realize it's an ideal image, but it's the idea. Another way to put this would be that you'd be doing your duty to our relationship without attachment. In other words, without agenda. This isn't about make you feel better. This is about Bob, get your act together type of thing. And it's dicey because we're in a relationship. I'm not sure if I'm going to hold that last comment I made about make you feel better. I'll tell you what I talk about with clients a fair bit, because I'm involved in leading groups at various treatment centers, and I'll ask clients, and they'll answer me honestly. They know what it's like to work with a recovery staff person, from a therapist to anybody else, and they can tell when that person has an agenda for them. It's actually more about that person than about the client. Right. Yeah. That I need you to get over this because for whatever the reason is. Right. And again, that's dicey because we're in a relationship and we have a right to have requirements in a relationship, but is there a way to do that non-violently? Is there a way to confront without anger, without aggression? Is there a way? I'll put it another way. Is it possible for me to be angry without anger? Is there possible for me to be angry and hold that anger lightly? Or maybe, how's this? Is it possible for me to be angry with humility? Is that there, but for the grace of God go I. And let me never forget, When I sit with my clients, I'm in recovery, I sit with clients, some of whom are contemplating going right back out and using again. Right. Can I be with them with humility because I am them and they are me? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it's easy to talk into this and be misunderstood because the question was a good question. I'm not talking about you enabling me. Right. It's not about you enabling me. It's about you being as forceful as you need to be, but without aggression, without harming me,
meekness. I think would I don't know if that would fit in there, but
it does.
Knowing that you can harm somebody, but knowing how to. Kind of push that down. Yeah.
There's one therapist I have a lot of respect for. He uses the word, the therapist must be aware of his or her fallibility. Yeah. That I don't start preaching at you from on high, that we're in this together, that we're human beings. Right. I'll often use the phrase when I'm working with clients in groups, I'll say, we're in the soup together. We're all in the soup together. I don't have there's no sense of superiority here. Couple more comments. I think what I'm going to do is kind of bookmark right where we are right now. We're about halfway through the presentation. It's been extremely valuable. This is a perfect example of what Odie and Austin and Bob want, is people interacting with us. And I'd far rather interact in dialogue without hurrying through more material. And I think what I'll do is I'll bookmark where we are right now. And there's a couple more questions or comments up here. Odie's example is very helpful. Which example?
I don't know.
The most recent one, which was?
Right.
Of the brick?
Yeah.
Of the brick. I agree. It took me a minute to get it. It was the Latin explanation that sealed it. No, it's a great explanation, is that they go hand in hand. I like this person. They quote one of my favorite authors in addiction is Gerald May. He's written a book called Addiction and Grace. Highly recommended. Gerald May. He's written several books that I've read, and all of them are wonderful. He's passed away. He was a psychiatrist in Washington who really touched my life deeply, including his writings about addiction. And in Gerald May's book, Addiction and Grace, he says, even the Apostle Paul from the New Testament stated that the spirit is willing and the body or the flesh is weak. Yeah. I think what we want to remember is that Odie is a spirit, or Odie is spirit, Bob is spirit, and that our flesh can be very weakened by addiction, but not to forget the spirit.
Right. Yeah.
You know, the image that I love to give is back in 1977 when I met my friend Faith. One of my first classes that junior year in college was a theology class where I had an opportunity to read the biography of Mother Teresa. And the biography, the title of it was Something Beautiful for God. And in it, the author described how it was that when Mother Teresa looked into the eyes of the lepers in Calcutta that she worked with, oftentimes young children to old age people dying with leprosy, is that when she looked into each of their eyes, she saw Christ. She was able to see their spirit. And I think that's extraordinary. I think that she definitely deserves being Saint Mother Teresa, you know, just really that capacity to see somebody's spirit no matter what's going on with the flesh.
Yeah.
There's another comment. Let me take a quick gander here. Ah, this is beautiful. This is beautiful. This is exactly what we were just talking about around the images of meekness and humility. This person says, when I was using, I had one friend who told me that their pain and fears came up, told me their pain and fears that came up for them when they saw me in addiction. Isn't that great? So this is a loved one saying, I'm scared. This is painful to me. And they're owning up to that. This person goes on to say, I felt their care, I bet, and how my actions impacted them, but I felt no negative judgment or coercion from them. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I think that ties into the example you gave.
That's exactly how I felt too. In the situations that I've been in. That definitely it takes you out of yourself. Yeah. You know, and you start seeing how it affects everybody else.
Right. I had a thought there. I'm waiting for it to come back. I know what the thought is that we talked earlier about how it is that we can be ashamed of our shame, and that we'll hide it, away. One of the things that we can also hide away from ourselves is our fear, and especially I'm in an office with three guys, all three guys here. I think guys especially, I think this is fair to say, are socialized to not be afraid, not ever evidence fear. It's seen as a sign of weakness. And I can't speak for women. I think we're all on a continuum probably in contemporary society, but I know being raised as a guy, I couldn't be some things. I couldn't be sad, and I couldn't be afraid. And when I'll ask a group of men, I said, well, what emotion can you be? Basically, they say two emotions. Either I'm good or I'm pissed. Okay. That's the smorgasbord. You know, the menu has two items. It has being fine, or being angry. And so oftentimes, as opposed to this example, which is a wonderful example, where a loved one comes and says, I'm scared, this is really paining me, people will lead with anger. And it's even understandable because they're so frustrated. They've been so violated. So the loved ones of those that are struggling with addiction oftentimes will lead with anger. And psychology talks about anger as being a secondary emotion. The secondary emotion is the anger, which means it suggests that there's a primary emotion. Well, the primary emotion oftentimes is fear. If I'm your husband, your wife, your father, your mother, I'm scared to death I'm going to lose you. Whatever you're doing is affecting our relationship, and it's not good. But I won't lead with that vulnerability. I'll lead with anger. And so it takes a lot of translating, especially on the receiving end, to realize that this person's anger probably is a lot of things, including fear. But how wonderful it is to have somebody be vulnerable and compassionate enough, meek enough to say, I'm scared for you. I'm pulling out my pen, crossing a line. Oh, my pen is out of ink. Okay, I'm going to have to remember. Oh, thank you. That was Austin's hand right there that you saw. I'm marking the PowerPoint. Thank you, Austin. I'm marking this right where we are right now. I tell you what I want to do is I'd like to pick up, if you guys are agreeable, I'd like to pick up on this topic in 2 weeks. I really, really appreciate the examples that you shared today. Really appreciate contributions from everyone in our audience. Thank you, Austin, for facilitating our connecting this way. This brings the material alive. You can sense today. I mean, I started today feeling some real sadness, and I shared that. And I still have that in me, but I'm not just that. I'm also really enjoying where we went today. What I'd like to do, this person says, they must be saying it to Odie. Do you have a photographic memory? I can tell because I do too.
That's definitely not aimed towards you.
Okay. Oh, I don't know about that. We remember what we remember, right? I'll tell you this. I know this for sure for me. Over the years, studying, I remember being in graduate school and reading books. And friends would say, Bob, can I borrow your book? And they'd borrow my book and they'd go, holy moly, Bob, because I write all over the book as I'm reading. And so something I discovered for myself very early on is that if I engage with the material in a way that matters to me, I remember it. And so I very rarely then, nor now, will read just that'd be a certain kind of, I guess, photographic memory. But I read very actively, and I read slowly, and I just interact, kind of like what we're doing, just kind of interacting with the material. And once I've done that, it seems like it never leaves. So that's what I do. Don't ever borrow books from me. It's kind of vulnerable because people will borrow books from me, and then the marginal, it'll say, my mom said this to me, or something like that. It's kind of personal, but it's a way for me to remember stuff. So thank you for the compliment. There's a question here about approaching a mother with addiction, and I think I'm going to ask that, Austin, could you forward that to me, and I'll respond. I want to wind down for today. I'd like to respond to you, and I'll respond to you in writing. Thank you for the questions, all of you for your questions today. Every question really matters. What I want to do is come back to this in 2 weeks, because next week we have another guest, and I'm really delighted. I want to say a word about our guest next week, and then we'll wind up for today. Next week's guest is a special friend of mine. I've known Cheryl for 15 years. She's a psychologist in the state of New Hampshire. I lived in New Hampshire and practiced with Cheryl for 3 years back in the past decade. And Cheryl's specialty is working in addiction. She's very, very bright and a lovely human being. I want to say two things to kind of set up her presentation next week. Is that I just read a report yesterday that in the last 15 years, the overdose deaths attributable to opioids has doubled in 15 years. It's a tragic statistic. So in a relatively short period of time, opioid overdose deaths has doubled nationally. And then I went and I read another article that came out yesterday, is that of all the states in the United States, 50 states in the United States, in terms of the opioid overdose death rate per capita, that is, how many per 100 people in a state are dying of overdoses, the state of New Hampshire, which is where Dr. Bildner is from, is number 2 in the country. It's not the biggest state, but per capita has the number 2 rate. The number 1 rate is West Virginia. And so really tragic. These states are just completely afflicted. It's almost the level of a, what do you call it when everybody gets epidemic? When it's talked about as the opioid epidemic, it's like an epidemic that's coming through, just wiping out massive amounts of the population. So Cheryl Bildner practices in the state of New Hampshire. She's going to be joining us next week from New Hampshire. We'll be streaming her in to join us, and she's working in concert with a company out of the state of Colorado, out of Boulder, Colorado, where the university is located. And they're working on delivering services. She lives in a rural area. This is where I lived too. She's working in a rural area where people don't have access to big hospitals and lots of treatment staff. There aren't addiction specialists in rural areas. And so Cheryl is working and coordinating in the state of New Hampshire treatment that can go out to rural areas. And they're doing a lot of it through what they call telehealth, through online, what we do here.
Yeah.
And so between online distribution and believe it or not, smartphone apps, computer apps, where people can do things that are germane to recovery from life-threatening addiction, that's what she's involved in, and she's on the very cutting edge of this. She'll be joining us next week, and I really invite you to come and have an experience of Cheryl. She's got a lot to offer. I'm really excited about her coming. So come next Wednesday. It'll be at the same time next week. It'll be evening time for Cheryl in New Hampshire when we come next week at 3 o'clock in the afternoon here Pacific time. And let me say one final word, and that is, as there was one question that came in right at the tail end, if there are any other questions of Odie or me from today, send them, forward them to me through the Facebook group. You can do that through Austin. You can also go to my website, just drbobweathers.com, and there's a contact me section. You can just send me, it's an email that'll come directly to me. So we'll continue with part 2 of our conversation about hope and what to do about addiction. I loved our conversation today. We'll come back to this in 2 weeks. Next week, come join me with Dr. Cheryl Bildner. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Odie. Thank you, Austin. Appreciate very much your engagement with us today. You all take good care. We'll see you next week.